Well, hello, Thrivers. Welcome to another day of Thrive Bible Devotions. Today we get to, go on in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Today we're going to be looking at verses 19 through 23. God is good. I hope that as we look at this, we'll be challenged to really make some changes in our lives as we endeavor to share the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, to further the gospel around us. Let's read the verses. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. Paul says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak became I weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. And I do it for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." Man, what a passage. One that's always challenged me. Always challenged me. If you've been watching or listening to these Thrive devotions the last 2 days, really their messages, the things we glean from that can really be summed up in the very first verse here, in verse 19, right? Paul says, and really it's the theme for the last couple of days, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." Man, and that really is, man, you know what, guys, that's a memory verse right there. Maybe that's what we all ought to memorize, right? "For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant of all, that I might win more of them." Paul, man, he was doing it, guys. He was furthering the gospel, and he was willing to do some things. Let's take a look at what this looked like for Paul. Paul says, one, he lived as a Jew. If he was around Jews, he was with Jewish people. He lived like them. In other words, he humbled himself and lived the life that they were living. Now, what am I saying? Did he? Yeah, I don't know what it looks like exactly, but I'll say this: he probably wasn't eating the things that were considered unclean. Probably wasn't drinking the things that were considered unclean. He was probably washing the way the Jews did, right? He was doing things that wouldn't make him an outsider with the Jews. He says, those under the law, that really the Jews, right? I would live as under the law. He would obey those things. He would do those things. Why? Because he didn't want any stumbling blocks. He didn't want anything in the way that would prevent him from sharing the gospel with people. He says, to those who are outside the law, I lived as being outside the law. Now keep in mind, when he talks about living under the law, he basically says, listen, we know that I'm not under the law, though. And here he says, I'm living outside the law. He says, listen, not that I'm just doing whatever I want, because there is God's law. There is, the law of Jesus Christ. In other words, there are things that are moral. There are things that are right. There are things that are wrong. There are things that God would have us not do. He didn't disobey those things, right? But he didn't worry about what he ate, what he drank. He was there with them. He ministered to them. He says he lived as the weak when he was around the weak. We see this example with Jesus too, don't we? Society was there. This is the way you were. He goes to the woman at the Samaritan woman at the well, and she's in shock that a Jew would talk to her. He's getting right down with her and chatting. Or with the poor, he would be right there with them, and minister to them. That's the example we see in Paul here and in Jesus. And why does Paul do it? He says, listen, I'm doing it so that the gospel can be preached. I'm doing it so I don't have stumbling blocks in the way. Who needs an obstacle in the way of the gospel proclamation? Man, guys, we ought not be having obstacles. We need to make sure those obstacles aren't there. Do what you can to get rid of the obstacles. Now, the question is then, what does this look like for us? Right? What does this look like for us? If we're to live our lives this way, what does that look like? Well, man, I don't know. I mean, first of all, I think we need to be willing to give up right? Some of the things we have, or the comforts we have, or the things like that for others. We need to be willing to give things up, to sacrifice. Maybe it's some of our comforts, right? Maybe it's some of our pride, to get right down there and deal with people that you wouldn't normally want to deal with. Maybe it's some of our time. These times we value so much. Maybe it's just giving up that and ministering to somebody. In truth, none of this is really ours to give anyway, right? It all belongs to God. That's the proper mindset here, right? It's not my comforts. It's not my pride. It's not my time. It all belongs to God anyway. We need to be willing to give these things up. I'll give you an illustration or an example, and I hate giving an example like this sometimes, especially when it's coming from my life, because let's be honest, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. I don't sacrifice as I should. But recently, this last year, there was a time that I think really illustrates this well, and a time that I did well. A time that I feel like was a success for me in my Christian walk and in the furtherance of the gospel. And frankly, well, let me just tell you the story. It was back in June at my mother's funeral. My mom died May 20th, and we had a funeral for her. And I love my mom. I miss my mother. Miss her dearly. But here we're having her funeral, and me and my brothers, we're kind of officiating the funeral. And we're there, we're mourning. I have my wife who's mourning, my children who are mourning, my brothers, my father, my nieces and nephews. All of us are mourning the loss of our mother, my mother, my brother's mother. And we're all mourning. Not only that, my mom's sisters and brothers were there. They're my cousins, my mom's cousins were there. Aunts were there. People, they're all mourning. And we're there in this situation, and as we're there, before I think it was before the service, someone came up to me and who I know well and said, "Hey Joel, we're here at the funeral. Obviously we're here at the funeral, but we're brought with us somebody who's close to us now, who's close to them now, and they don't know Jesus. They're not saved. And would you be willing to talk to them?" And of course, I say of course, I'm not going to say no. Right? No, I'm not going to go share the gospel. But I'll tell you what, inside I was like, man, I'm mourning here. The last thing I want to do is go talk to some stranger, a person I don't know, and spend. How selfish, right? That's how I felt. Of course, we have the funeral. After the funeral, he comes up to me again and says, "Hey, can you go talk to this person still?" And I'm like, "Yeah," but again, I'm trying to do it. Anyway, maybe a third time. I mean, it may have been 3 or 4. I don't know how many times they came up to me. And listen, could he had shared the gospel with them? You would never. You wouldn't call him. I wouldn't call myself a model Christian. You wouldn't call them a model Christian. I don't know any Christian that would call them model Christians. But he really wanted me to do that. So what did I do? Well, you know what? Eventually, when I got right with God in this, in this thing, I left everything going on with the funeral, the time where people were kind of hanging out and spending time eating food and sharing stories and mourning with each other. I left all that, went out to the parking lot, left the church, went out to the church parking lot. And why? Because you know what? They're out there, smoking and doing the things that typical Christians don't do, right? I say, anyway, you know what I mean? There's no judgment here whatsoever, okay? And I go out there to talk to this person, and I'm gonna find out the person is recently out of prison, has had drug issues and issues like that, right? Even just looking at the person, not dressed as my family or my church would expect you to dress at a funeral. I don't care. It doesn't bother me at all. But I'm just giving context here, right? There's a humbling going on here. And what did I do? I got out there, I got real with the guy. I talked to him. I didn't just go, okay, listen, I got to go share the gospel with this guy here. Here's what, no, you know what? Get to know him. Why are, what's talking? Who are you? Get to know you. Obviously, you're important to these people. You're important to me. And make that clear and spend some time with them. And not just them, but then what's his story? Oh, I see. Yeah. So you got off drugs recently and you got out of prison recently. Great. And you were there. It was pretty bad. Yeah. And hearing that and to be able to sit there and go, you know what? All that, and to get real with them and to be able to share the gospel with them. And And I would love to say that he accepted Christ there. He didn't. Matter of fact, I pray for him on a regular basis. He feels like he's just too bad of a person to be forgiven, right? That's the whole thing, right? We're all evil and awful and don't deserve to be forgiven. And he's hung up on that. And I have no doubt that the people he was with are going to be sharing the gospel with them more. And I hope that my time with them furthered the gospel. But listen, you know what? Finally, I spent a half hour, 40 minutes out there with him, and why? And by 40 minutes, people are looking for me, wondering where Joel is. They need something, or they want something, or, they want to talk about mom, whatever that is. I was gone. I gave up my time. I gave up my time of mourning with others, gave up, my comfort. And I say mine, none of this is mine. Willing to spend time with this young man and share the gospel with him, right? And be real with him. Now, look, I could have said no, right? And just not done it. And many Christians I know would have done that, right? They would say, no, this is not the appropriate time. I'm not going to go do that. And thank God I was willing to become a servant to not only this person, but to the people he was with, right? And I did it for a reason, right? I did not for my own glory, not for my own sake, right? I did it for the furtherance of the gospel. I did it for the same reason Paul did it when he says in verse 23, and I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. That's what it comes to, guys. Now listen, I hope as we listen to this, we talk about this, let us commit together, right? You and I, let us commit together to be willing to become servants to all, right? That we might win more people to Christ. What changes, what changes do we have to make to do that? And man, when we are willing to do this, guys, when we are willing to commit to this together, what a changed world this world would be, right? What a changed world this world would be if more Christians would be willing to live life this way. Guys, I love you. And I hope that we can do that. If this has been a blessing, I would encourage you guys, put in the comments, what is it? What is it that we're, maybe we need to give up? Maybe you need to give up that would, maybe something you can be humbled about, or something you can do that's going to help you be a servant to all, help you further the gospel. I would love to have that discussion in our comments. Wouldn't that be great? All right, guys, I hope you have a good weekend. We'll be back on Monday. God bless you.